Sometimes the coldest winters teach us the warmest lessons about human kindness. We've all felt forgotten at some point, wondering if anyone would notice if we just disappeared. In 1882, Samuel Bear Carver had spent 15 years alone in the Wyoming mountains. He trusted no one and needed no one. When he came to town for supplies, he found Eliza Kane bleeding in the snow, robbed and abandoned with winter closing in. She looked up at him and whispered the words that would change everything. "I don't want to die this winter." Bear faced a choice that would test everything he believed about himself. He could walk away like he always did, or he could offer shelter to a stranger in his mountain cabin. But would saving her life mean losing the peace he'd fought so hard to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Bear Carver found Eliza Kane. The frost had painted Cedar Ridge in silver and silence. Every breath hung like smoke in the bitter air, and the few souls brave enough to venture outside moved with the hurried purpose of those who understood that winter in Wyoming territory was not a season, it was a test of will. Bear stood 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, his beard streaked with premature gray that spoke of hard years rather than age. At 41, he carried himself with the careful economy of movement that marked men who had learned to conserve their strength for when it mattered most. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with mountain life, rested easy on the reins of his pack mule as he guided the animal down the main street of Cedar Ridge. The town itself was little more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the vast indifference of the mountains. Miller's General Store anchored one end of the street, its windows glowing yellow with lamplight, even in the grey dawn. The livery stable squatted at the other end like a patient beast, steam rising from its interior where the horses sought refuge from the cold. Between them stood the saloon, the boarding house, and a handful of other establishments that served the needs of trappers, miners, and the occasional foolhardy traveler who found themselves this far from civilization as winter settled in. Bear had been making this journey down from the high country for 15 years, always in late November, always alone. He would trade his furs for supplies, coffee, salt, ammunition, maybe a book or two if Mrs. Miller had anything new, and then disappear back into the mountains before anyone could engage him in more than the most necessary conversation. The townspeople had long ago stopped trying to draw him out. They knew him as a man who kept his own counsel and paid his debts, and in a place like Cedar Ridge, that was recommendation enough. What they didn't know was that Samuel Carver had once been Sergeant Samuel Carson of the 7th Cavalry, a man who had followed orders without question and believed in the righteous cause of bringing order to the frontier. That man had died in a place called Willow Creek, along with his wife Sarah and their infant son Thomas, victims of a raid that Carson had been powerless to prevent, despite all his training and dedication. The man who walked away from that burned homestead had taken a new name and sought a place where the reach of memory could not follow. His cabin sat 8 miles up the mountain, accessible only by a trail that became impassable to all but the most determined once the heavy snows began. It was a solid structure of pine logs and careful craftsmanship, built to withstand the worst that Wyoming winter could deliver. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with the accumulated wisdom of a man who had learned to value books as much as bullets. His leather journal rested on the rough-hewn table beside the window, its pages chronicling not just the practical details of mountain survival, but the gradual healing of a man who had once thought himself beyond redemption. The journal held 15 years of careful observations, weather patterns, animal behaviors, the subtle signs that distinguished a mild winter from a killer. But it also contained something else, fragments of the man he had been, memories carefully preserved, like pressed flowers between its pages. On lonely nights, Bear would sometimes read his own words back to himself, testing whether the pain had dulled enough to allow him to remember Sarah's laugh or Thomas's tiny fist wrapped around his finger. This morning, however, his mind was focused on practical matters. His supplies were running low, and the signs all pointed to a winter that would test even his considerable preparations. The animals had been gathering food with unusual urgency, and the high cirrus clouds held that particular quality of light that promised heavy snow within the week. He needed coffee, salt pork, ammunition for his rifle, and lamp oil enough to last until spring. He had completed his business at Miller's store and was securing his purchases when he heard the sound that changed everything. A soft whimper, barely audible above the morning wind. Most men might have ignored it, dismissed it as the cry of a stray dog or the settling of wood in the cold. But 15 years of mountain living had taught Bear to pay attention to sounds that didn't belong. Behind the livery stable, partially hidden by a broken wagon wheel that had been abandoned against the building's wall, he found her. Eliza Kane lay curled in a ball, her dark hair matted with ice, her lips blue with cold. Her dress, once a respectable traveling outfit, was torn and stained with blood. Her hands were raw from the cold, and when she looked up at him, her brown eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stared death in the face and found it looking back. She was perhaps 29, though suffering had aged her beyond her years. Even in her current state, Bear could see that she had once been beautiful, with fine features and an intelligent expression that spoke of education and refinement. What she was doing alone in Cedar Ridge in the middle of winter, dressed for travel but clearly robbed of her belongings, was a question that hung in the frigid air between them. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible through chattering teeth. "I don't want to die this winter." The words hit Bear like a physical blow. He had spent 15 years telling himself that he was done with caring about other people's troubles, that he had paid his debt to human suffering and earned the right to live for himself alone. Yet something in her voice, not just the desperation, but an underlying strength that refused to surrender, even in extremity, stirred something in him that he thought had died at Willow Creek. He knelt beside her, his experienced eyes quickly cataloguing her condition. Exposure, obviously, but not so far advanced as to be irreversible. The blood on her clothes appeared to be from superficial wounds, cuts and scrapes, consistent with a struggle rather than serious injury. She was conscious and coherent, which meant her core temperature hadn't dropped to dangerous levels. Yet, "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Eliza," she managed. "Eliza Kane. They took everything. My bags, my money, my can." She reached instinctively for her left hand, where Bear noticed the pale band of skin where a wedding ring had been. "Who took it?" "3 men. Rode up on me yesterday, maybe 2 miles out of town. Said they were just passing through, seemed friendly enough." Then she shuddered, and not just from the cold. Bear had encountered men like that before, predators who haunted the lonely trails looking for easy prey. In the civilized world, they might be called highwaymen or bandits. Out here, they were simply wolves in human form, and they rarely left witnesses behind. The fact that Eliza was alive suggested either unusual mercy on their part or extraordinary luck on hers. "You have people expecting you somewhere?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something far away. "No," she said finally. "Nobody expecting me anywhere." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they wanted to cross. Bear understood that kind of aloneness, the peculiar freedom and terror of having no one in the world who would notice if you simply vanished. It was a state he had chosen deliberately, but for her, he sensed, it had been thrust upon her by circumstances beyond her control. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of snow. Bear could see the storm clouds gathering over the western peaks, dark and heavy with moisture that would soon turn to ice. Cedar Ridge might see flurries by evening and a full blizzard before dawn. Anyone caught unprepared would not survive it. He made his decision without conscious thought, acting on an impulse that came from some part of himself he had thought buried. "Can you travel?" he asked. "I think so." "Where?" "My cabin. 8 miles up the mountain. It's warm, it's safe, and it's got enough supplies to last the winter." She stared at him with a mixture of hope and wariness. A sensible woman would be suspicious of any man offering shelter in such circumstances. The frontier was full of stories about women who had trusted the wrong stranger and paid dearly for their mistake. But as she studied Bear's weathered face, something in his steady grey eyes seemed to reassure her. "Why would you help me?" she asked. It was a fair question, and one Bear wasn't entirely sure he could answer. The practical part of his mind was already cataloguing the complications her presence would bring to his carefully ordered solitude. But another part, long dormant, recognized something in her that called to the man he had been before loss, had taught him to fear attachment. "Because," he said simply, "nobody should die alone in the cold." He helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her left ankle and the way she moved carefully to avoid aggravating her injuries. She was stronger than she looked, though, with the kind of resilience that came from surviving more than one crisis. As they walked slowly toward where his mule waited, Bear found himself wondering what circumstances had brought a woman of obvious education and refinement to be traveling alone through Wyoming territory in winter. The townspeople watched their passage with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Miller stepped out of her store long enough to catch Bear's eye and nod toward Eliza with a questioning look. Bear's almost imperceptible nod in return seemed to satisfy her that the situation was under control, at least for the moment. At the general store, Bear purchased additional supplies, extra coffee, more salt pork, an additional blanket, and some basic medicines. His silent additions to the order told their own story to anyone who cared to observe, though he offered no explanations. The storekeeper, a pragmatic man who had learned not to ask too many questions about his customers' business, simply totaled the purchases and accepted Bear's payment with professional discretion. As they prepared to leave town, Eliza looked back at Cedar Ridge with an expression Bear couldn't quite read. Relief, perhaps, mixed with something that might have been regret. She was leaving behind whatever life had brought her to this desperate moment, trading one uncertainty for another. But as the first fat snowflakes began to fall from the grey sky, Bear thought he saw her shoulders straighten slightly, as if she was consciously choosing to face forward rather than backward. The trail up to his cabin would be challenging under the best of circumstances. With a storm coming and an injured woman to consider, it would require all of Bear's mountain skills to get them both to safety. But as he helped Eliza onto the mule and began the slow journey up the winding mountain path, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The weight of responsibility for another human life and the strange lightness that came with it. The trail up Bear Mountain had been carved by generations of elk and deer, then widened by trappers who understood that the mountain offered both refuge and challenge in equal measure. Now, as fat snowflakes began to fall in earnest, Bear led his mule carefully along the narrow path while Eliza rode behind him, her hands clutching the makeshift reins he had fashioned from rope. Every few hundred yards, Bear would stop and look back, ostensibly to check on Eliza's condition, but really to scan the valley below for signs of pursuit. The men who had robbed her might return to finish what they started, especially if they discovered she had survived to tell her tale. Bear's instincts, honed by years of cavalry service and mountain living, told him that wolves, whether four-legged or two, rarely left wounded prey to escape. "How much farther?" Eliza asked, her voice barely audible over the increasing wind. 3 miles, maybe 4. The trail gets steeper from here, but there's a shelter about halfway up, where we can rest if needed." She nodded, though Bear noticed how she held herself stiffly in the saddle, fighting against both pain and exhaustion. Her ankle was clearly worse than she had admitted, and the cold was sapping what little strength she had left. But there was no turning back now. The storm was building faster than Bear had anticipated, and Cedar Ridge would offer no sanctuary if the men who had attacked her decided to return. As they climbed higher, the wind began to howl through the pine trees with the voice of approaching winter. Bear wrapped his coat tighter around himself and urged the mule forward, knowing that speed now mattered more than comfort. Behind him, he could hear Eliza's labored breathing, but she made no complaint. There was steel in this woman, he realized, the kind forged by experience rather than born of stubbornness. The first sign of real trouble came when they reached the halfway point. Bear had been leading the mule around a particularly treacherous switchback when he heard the sound of horses below them on the trail. 3 riders, moving fast despite the worsening conditions. Even at a distance, Bear could see they were pushing their mounts harder than wise men would in such weather. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully. There are men coming up the trail behind us. Could be innocent travelers, but I doubt it. We're going to move off the main path and wait for them to pass." Her face went pale, but she nodded understanding. Bear led the mule into a stand of dense pine trees about 50 yards from the trail, tying the animal securely and motioning for Eliza to dismount. Together, they crouched behind a fallen log and waited. The riders came into view 10 minutes later, their horses blowing hard from the climb. Bear studied them carefully. 3 men, heavily armed, with the hard look of men who lived by violence. The leader was a tall, lean man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His companions were younger, but no less dangerous looking. They moved with the casual confidence of predators who had rarely encountered serious opposition. "She came this way," the scarred man called out, his voice carrying clearly on the cold air. "Trail's fresh, and there's only one place up this mountain a man could take a woman to winter over." "Oh." One of the younger men shifted in his saddle. "Maybe we should wait until the storm passes, Jake. That trail gets mighty treacherous in the snow." Jake's laugh was as cold as the wind. "You afraid of a little weather, boy? We finish this today, or spend the whole winter looking over our shoulders? Besides," he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something that glinted in the grey light. "Mrs. Kane here left us a little present. Seems her wedding ring's worth more than we thought. Pure gold, with the inscription inside. To Elizabeth, with eternal love, Charles Kane. Now, what do you suppose old Charles would pay to get his beloved wife back?" Eliza's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Bear felt her stiffen beside him. He reached out and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, feeling her trembling with more than just cold. The stolen wedding ring represented more than just monetary value. It was the last tangible connection to whatever life she had fled. "Course," Jake continued, "Charles might not be too happy to hear about his wife traveling alone, meeting strange men in mountain cabins. Might be she's worth more to us than to him, if you catch my meaning." The implication hung in the air like a threat. These men weren't just bandits. They were the worst kind of opportunists, willing to use whatever leverage they could find to extract maximum profit from their victims. Bear had encountered their kind during the war, men who saw suffering as a commodity to be traded. The third rider, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "What if she's already dead? Cold like this, exposure could have taken her hours ago." "Then we find her body and take what we can," Jake replied matter-of-factly, "but my guess is she found herself some help. Mountain man like the one we saw in town, he might be the charitable type. We find his cabin, we find our payday." They spurred their horses forward, continuing up the trail toward Bear's cabin. Bear waited until they were well out of sight before emerging from hiding, his mind already working through their limited options. The cabin was defensible, but not against 3 armed men who knew it was there, and with Eliza injured and weak, running was not an option. "Those men," Eliza whispered, "they're not just bandits, are they?" Bear shook his head. "Bounty hunters, most likely, or worse. Either way, they've got business with you that goes beyond simple robbery." Eliza closed her eyes, and when she opened them, Bear saw a depth of pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. "My husband," she said quietly, "he's not a good man. If he's put a price on my head for running away—" "Then we make sure they don't collect it," Bear interrupted. He helped her back onto the mule, his movements quick and efficient. Change of plans. "We're not going to the cabin, not directly. There's an old trapper's shelter about a mile off the main trail. We'll hole up there until the storm passes and those men move on." "What if they don't move on?" Bear's expression was grim. "Then we deal with them when we have to." The trapper's shelter was little more than a lean-to built against the side of a granite outcropping, but it would provide protection from the worst of the wind and snow. Bear got a small fire going while Eliza huddled against the rock wall, her face drawn with exhaustion and pain. As the storm intensified around them, Bear found himself studying the woman he had impulsively decided to help. There were layers to her story that she hadn't shared, depths of trouble that went beyond a simple case of highway robbery. The careful way she spoke, her obvious education, the quality of her torn clothing, everything suggested a woman from a world far removed from the harsh realities of frontier life. "Why are you really running?" he asked finally. Eliza was quiet for so long that Bear thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because staying would have killed me. Maybe not all at once, but piece by piece, until there was nothing left of who I used to be." It was an answer that told him everything and nothing, but Bear understood the weight of words left unspoken. He had his own reasons for choosing isolation over connection, his own demons that had driven him to seek refuge in these mountains. The difference was that his choice had been his own. Hers, he suspected, had been forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. Outside the shelter, the wind howled with increasing fury, and the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that would soon make travel impossible. They were committed now to whatever course fate had set for them. 3 dangerous men were hunting them through a mountain storm, and somewhere below in the civilized world, other forces were likely mobilizing to reclaim a woman who had dared to choose freedom over security. As Bear fed small branches to the fire and listened to the storm rage overhead, he realized that his 15 years of carefully maintained solitude were coming to an end. Whether he lived or died in the coming days, he would no longer be the same man who had climbed this mountain, seeking escape from the world's troubles. That man had made his choice the moment he decided that nobody should die alone in the cold. The woman beside him represented everything he had tried to leave behind: responsibility, vulnerability, the terrible risk of caring about someone else's fate. But as he watched her sleep fitfully in the firelight, her face peaceful despite the danger that surrounded them, Bear felt something stir in his chest that he had thought dead and buried. Hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that some choices, once made, change a man forever. Dawn came grey and muffled, the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. Bear woke to find Eliza already awake, sitting up against the rock wall with her knees drawn to her chest, staring out at the transformed landscape. Snow had piled 3 feet deep in places, turning the familiar mountain terrain into something alien and pristine. "How's the ankle?" he asked, stirring the embers of their fire back to life. "Better," she replied, though the careful way she moved suggested otherwise. The rest helped. Bear studied the trail conditions while he heated water for coffee. The snow would slow any pursuit, but it would also make their own travel more treacherous. More importantly, the storm had likely covered their tracks, giving them a temporary advantage over the men hunting them. "We can reach the cabin by midday if we take it slow," he said, handing her a cup of steaming coffee. "But we need to talk about what happens when we get there." Eliza wrapped her hands around the warm cup, inhaling the rich aroma with obvious pleasure. "I won't bring trouble to your home," she said quietly. "If those men are determined to find me, maybe it would be better if I kept moving." "To where?" Bear's question was gentle but direct. "You said yourself you have no one expecting you anywhere." And in your condition, in this weather, you wouldn't last 2 days on the trail." The truth of his words hung between them. Eliza took a sip of coffee, her brown eyes thoughtful. "Then, what do you suggest? We winter together," Bear said simply. "My cabin's built to withstand a siege if necessary. Plenty of supplies, good defensive positions, and I know these mountains better than any bounty hunter ever will. Come spring, when the passes open up, we figure out your next move." It was a practical solution, but Bear could see the conflict playing out on Eliza's face. Accepting his help meant placing herself in debt to a stranger, becoming dependent on a man she barely knew. For someone who had fled one form of captivity, the prospect of another, however benevolent, must be troubling. "I can work," she said finally. "I taught school back east before I married. I can read, write, keep accounts. I'm not helpless." Bear nodded, understanding the pride behind her words. "Good. I've got books that need organizing, and my handwriting's never been much to speak of. Having someone who can help me keep proper records of supplies and such would be useful." It wasn't entirely true. Bear had managed his solitary life quite well for 15 years, but he sensed Eliza's need to contribute, to feel like a partner rather than a burden. The mountain had taught him that survival often depended as much on purpose as on resources. They made good time to the cabin despite the snow, arriving just as the pale winter sun reached its highest point. Bear's home sat in a natural clearing surrounded by tall pines, its log walls chinked tight against the cold and its stone chimney trailing a thin line of smoke into the clear air. He had banked the fire before leaving for town, a precaution that now proved wise. "It's beautiful," Eliza said softly, taking in the sight of the sturdy cabin with its covered porch and neat woodshed. Bear felt an unexpected flutter of pride at her approval. He had built this place with his own hands, felling every tree and setting every stone with the meticulous care of a man who knew his life might depend on the quality of his work. To see it through someone else's eyes, someone who could appreciate the craftsmanship rather than simply taking it for granted, stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Inside, the cabin was larger than it appeared from without. The main room served as kitchen, sitting area, and library, with shelves of books lining 2 full walls. A stone fireplace dominated one end, while a large window faced east to catch the morning light. A sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder provided privacy, and a smaller room off the main area served as Bear's workshop and storage space. "You can have the loft," Bear said, stirring the banked coals back to flame. "I'll sleep down here by the fire, more practical for keeping watch anyway." Eliza climbed the ladder slowly, favoring her injured ankle, and Bear heard her sharp intake of breath as she took in the view from the loft window. From that vantage point, the entire valley spread out below, with the town of Cedar Ridge visible as a cluster of tiny buildings in the distance. "I can see anyone coming up the trail from here," she called down. "Miles away." "That was the idea," Bear replied, hanging his coat on a wooden peg by the door. "In 15 years, I've never had unwelcome visitors make it to the cabin without me knowing they were coming." When Eliza climbed back down, Bear was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping them away with the back of her hand. It's been so long since I felt safe anywhere." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications that Bear wasn't ready to explore. Instead, he busied himself with practical matters, showing Eliza where he kept the supplies, how the water system worked, and the various routines that kept the cabin functioning through the harsh mountain winter. As the afternoon wore on, they fell into an easy working rhythm. Eliza proved to have practical skills that complemented her education. She could cook, mend clothes, and organize supplies with an efficiency that spoke of experience managing a household. Bear found himself carving a wooden spoon as he watched her work, his hands moving automatically, while his mind processed this fundamental change to his solitary existence. The spoon took shape slowly under his knife, the wood smooth and warm in his hands. It was unnecessary work. He had plenty of utensils already, but something about Eliza's presence made him want to create rather than simply maintain. The simple act of carving felt different with someone to share the space, more purposeful somehow. "You're an artist," Eliza observed, watching him work the wood. Bear shook his head. "Just a man with too much time on his hands." "No," she insisted quietly. "There's beauty in useful things made with care. My father was a carpenter back in Ohio. He taught me to recognize good craftsmanship." As evening approached, they shared a simple meal of salt, pork and beans, seasoned with wild herbs Bear had gathered during the autumn. The conversation came easier now, touching on safe topics, books they had both read, the beauty of the mountain landscape, practical matters of winter survival. But underneath the comfortable domesticity, both remained acutely aware of the danger that might still be hunting them through the snow. After supper, as Eliza organized Bear's extensive library with obvious delight, he stepped outside to check the approaches to the cabin. The snow lay undisturbed except for the tracks of small animals, and the night air carried no sounds of human passage. But Bear's instincts, sharpened by years of danger, told him that their respite was temporary. When he returned to the cabin, he found Eliza curled in the chair beside the fire, reading by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment their eyes met across the warm space. Something passed between them in that glance, recognition, perhaps, of the strange comfort they found in each other's presence. "Thank you," she said simply. Bear nodded, understanding that her gratitude encompassed more than just shelter and safety. In choosing to help her, he had offered something precious and rare, the gift of being seen as worthy of rescue. And in accepting his help with grace rather than resentment, she had given him something equally valuable, a reason to believe that his long exile from human connection might not be permanent after all. 3 days passed in a routine that felt both foreign and familiar to Bear. Each morning, he would wake to find Eliza already up, tending the fire and preparing coffee with the efficient movements of someone who understood the importance of small comforts. They would share breakfast in companionable silence, then turn to the day's tasks, checking supplies, maintaining equipment, and slowly adapting to the rhythms of shared solitude. On the 4th morning, Bear found her standing at the east window, staring down at something in the valley with obvious concern. He joined her, following her gaze to a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of Cedar Ridge. "That's not coming from the town," he observed quietly. "No," Eliza agreed. "It's maybe 2 miles this side of it, right about where—" She stopped, her face pale. "Where what?" "Where those men might have made camp." She turned to face him, her brown eyes troubled. "They're still out there, aren't they? Waiting." Bear nodded grimly. He had been expecting this. Men like Jake didn't give up easily, especially when they sensed a substantial payday. The storm had bought them time, but it hadn't eliminated the threat. "We need to talk about your husband," he said gently, "about why you really left." Eliza moved away from the window, settling into the chair by the fire. For a long moment, she stared into the flames, and Bear could see her working through some internal struggle. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but carried the weight of carefully contained pain. "Charles Kane is a respected businessman in Chicago," she began. "Owns a shipping company, sits on the boards of several banks. To the outside world, he's the perfect gentleman, charming, successful, devoted to his wife." She paused, her hands clenched in her lap. "Behind closed doors, he's a monster." Bear had suspected as much from the careful way she moved, the wariness in her eyes when anyone approached too quickly. He had seen the signs before, in army camps where some soldiers' wives bore bruises that couldn't be explained by household accidents. "The beating started 6 months after we married," Eliza continued. "Always where the marks wouldn't show, always followed by flowers and apologies and promises that it would never happen again. I believed him at first, wanted to believe him. What changed?" Eliza reached into her dress pocket and pulled out something small and dark, a compass, its face cracked and its needle spinning wildly. This was my father's. He gave it to me when I left home, said it would always help me find my way. Charles broke it during one of his rages, threw it against the wall when I tried to use it to plan a trip to visit my sister. She held the broken compass in her palm, its damaged face catching the firelight. That's when I realized I had lost my way completely. I was living in a beautiful house, wearing fine clothes, attending elegant parties, and dying a little more each day. The compass couldn't show me direction anymore, but it reminded me that I once knew how to navigate my own life. Bear understood the symbolism, how something meant to provide guidance had become a token of imprisonment, then, ultimately, a catalyst for escape. How did you get away? Charles had business in Denver. I was supposed to accompany him, but I feigned illness at the last moment. As soon as his train left the station, I packed what I could carry and took the first westbound stage. I hoped that he would be too proud to chase after me publicly. A man in his position couldn't afford the scandal of admitting his wife had run away. But you underestimated his need for control. Eliza nodded bitterly. He couldn't let me go because it would mean admitting that someone had defied him successfully. So he hired those men, probably told them I was unstable, that I needed to be brought back for my own safety. He's very good at making his cruelty look like concern. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place for Bear. Jake and his men weren't just random bandits, they were professionals, hired to retrieve a specific target. That made them more dangerous than simple opportunists, but also more predictable. They would be methodical, patient, and ultimately vulnerable to someone who understood their methods. There's something else, Eliza said quietly. Something I haven't told you. Bear waited, recognizing the struggle playing out on her face. I'm not actually married to Charles anymore. I mean, legally I suppose I am. But she took a shaky breath. I was pregnant when I left Chicago. I lost the baby 2 weeks into my journey west. A miscarriage brought on by stress and the beating Charles gave me the night before he left for Denver. The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. Bear felt something cold settle in his chest, not just anger at the man who had caused such pain, but a deeper recognition of the losses that had shaped them both. They were more alike than he had realized, two people carrying the weight of lives that should have been. I'm sorry, he said simply. Eliza wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. I buried the child in a little cemetery outside a town called Sweetwater. There's no marker, nothing to show they ever existed. But I know, and Charles will never know, never have the chance to hurt that innocent life the way he hurt me. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to coals. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and moaning through the pine trees. The sound seemed to underscore their isolation, the vast distance between this mountain sanctuary and the civilized world, where men like Charles Kane wielded their power without consequence. What will you do when spring comes? Bear asked eventually. I don't know, Eliza admitted. Keep running, I suppose. Find some place where Charles can't reach me. Start over with a new name. Running's a hard way to live. So is staying in one place when someone's hunting you. Bear considered this, turning the broken compass over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. He had chosen isolation as his solution to unbearable loss. But isolation was a luxury that required resources, money, skills, and the kind of solitude that few people could achieve or maintain. For Eliza, running was not a choice but a necessity, and eventually, necessity would wear her down. Maybe there's another way, he said finally. What do you mean? Bear wasn't entirely sure what he meant, but something was taking shape in his mind, a possibility that had been growing stronger with each day of their companionship. For 15 years, he had told himself that solitude was enough, that he needed no one and nothing beyond his books and his mountain refuge. But having Eliza here had awakened something he thought dead, the desire to protect something more valuable than his own peace of mind. I mean, maybe it's time to stop running, he said. Maybe it's time to make a stand. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. Two broken people, each carrying the weight of their separate tragedies, had found in each other the possibility of something neither had dared hope for, not just survival, but the chance to reclaim their lives from those who had tried to destroy them. The broken compass lay between them on the table, its needle spinning wildly in the firelight. But for the first time since leaving Chicago, Eliza felt as though she might be heading in the right direction after all. The blizzard that arrived the next evening came without warning, transforming the mountain from a place of stark beauty into a white-walled prison. For 3 days, the wind howled with such fury that venturing even to the woodshed became a life-threatening endeavor. Bear and Eliza found themselves confined to the cabin's main room, the world beyond the windows erased by sheets of driving snow. On the first day, they maintained the careful distance that had characterized their interactions. Eliza organizing books, Bear maintaining his equipment, both acutely aware of the other's presence, but respectful of the invisible boundaries that marked their separate spaces. By the second day, however, the enforced intimacy began to work its own subtle magic. "Would you like me to read aloud?" Eliza asked as they sat by the fire after their evening meal. "I used to read to my students. It helps pass the time." Bear nodded, settling back in his chair with a rare sense of contentment. He had forgotten the pleasure of being read to, the way a skilled voice could bring words to life in ways that silent reading could not achieve. Eliza chose a volume of poetry from his shelves, Whitman, whose celebration of the American landscape seemed appropriate for their mountain sanctuary. As her clear voice filled the cabin with the cadences of Song of Myself, Bear found himself watching her face in the firelight. There was something almost magical about the transformation that came over her when she read. The careful wariness that marked her usual expression gave way to something more open, more genuinely herself. He began to understand what she had been before Charles Kane had tried to break her spirit. "You were a good teacher," he said when she finished the poem. "I loved it," she replied simply. "There's something wonderful about watching young minds discover the power of words, the way literature can open up whole worlds of possibility." "What grade did you teach?" "8th and 9th, old enough to grapple with real ideas, young enough to still believe that anything was possible." Her expression grew wistful. "I had plans once to start a school for girls, somewhere out west where women could get the same education as men. Foolish dreams, I suppose." "Why foolish?" Eliza gestured toward the storm raging outside. "Look where those dreams led me. Hiding in a mountain cabin, running from hired guns, dependent on the kindness of a stranger." Bear was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Seems to me," he said finally, "that you're exactly where those dreams led you, to a place where you can think for yourself again, make your own choices. That's not foolish, that's brave." Something shifted in the space between them at his words. Eliza looked at him with surprise, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Is that what you think I am? Brave?" "I think," Bear said slowly, "that it takes more courage to leave a comfortable cage than most people ever show in their entire lives." The conversation continued late into the night, ranging from books to philosophy to the simple pleasures of mountain life. Bear found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years. His time in the cavalry, the satisfaction of building the cabin with his own hands, the subtle signs that marked the changing seasons in the high country. In return, Eliza painted pictures of her childhood in Ohio, her father's workshop, the little schoolhouse where she had first discovered her calling as a teacher. As the days of enforced confinement stretched on, their conversations grew deeper and more personal. Bear learned about Eliza's love of wildflowers, her talent for sketching, her dream of someday seeing the Pacific Ocean. Eliza discovered Bear's unexpected knowledge of literature, his skill at chess, and the gentleness that lay beneath his gruff exterior. On the third evening, as they sat playing chess by lamplight, Eliza made a move that surprised Bear with its strategic sophistication. "You're better at this than you let on," he observed. "My father taught me," she replied, studying the board. "He said chess was like life. You had to think several moves ahead, but you also had to be ready to adapt when your opponent surprised you. Sounds like a wise man." He was. He died when I was 17, before he could see me married. She paused, her hand hovering over her queen. "I sometimes wonder what he would have thought of Charles, whether he would have seen through the charm to the man underneath." Bear watched her make her move, a sacrifice that opened up an unexpected attack on his king. "I think," he said carefully, "that any father who taught his daughter chess was already preparing her to recognize a worthy opponent." The compliment hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Eliza felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, while Bear found himself wondering when he had stopped seeing her as a responsibility and started seeing her as a woman whose good opinion mattered to him. Later that night, as Eliza prepared for bed in the loft, she discovered something tucked beneath her pillow, a small wildflower, perfectly preserved between the pages of a book. She recognized it as one she had mentioned loving during their conversations, a delicate mountain bloom that she had described seeing in her father's botanical drawings. Bear must have pressed it sometime during the autumn, saving it with the careful attention to detail that marked everything he did. The gesture was small but profound in its thoughtfulness. In a world where she had grown accustomed to grand gestures that masked cruel intentions, there was something deeply moving about such quiet consideration. She held the pressed flower carefully, studying its perfect form in the lamplight, and felt something bloom in her chest that she had thought dead and buried. Below in the main room, Bear banked the fire for the night and settled into his bedroll. He had been acting on impulse when he left the flower for her, moved by some urge to give her something beautiful without expectation of return. Now, lying in the darkness and listening to the storm rage outside, he wondered if he had crossed some invisible line. The truth was that his feelings for Eliza had been evolving since the moment he found her in the snow. What had begun as simple compassion had deepened into something more complex: respect for her courage, admiration for her intelligence, and an attraction that grew stronger with each passing day. But Bear was a man who had learned to be wary of his own emotions, to question motives and examine feelings with the skeptical eye of someone who had lost everything once before. Was he truly falling in love with this remarkable woman, or was he simply grateful for companionship after 15 years of solitude? Was his desire to protect her born of genuine feeling, or merely the awakening of instincts that had lain dormant too long? These were questions that had no easy answers, especially trapped as they were in the enforced intimacy of the storm-bound cabin. What Bear did know was that the thought of spring and Eliza's inevitable departure filled him with something that felt suspiciously like grief. Somewhere in the space of a few short weeks, his carefully ordered solitude had been transformed into something rich and complex and utterly unpredictable. The woman sleeping in his loft had become far more than a winter guest. She had become the possibility of a future he had never dared imagine. January arrived with a brief warming spell that melted the top layer of snow and filled the mountain air with the sound of trickling water. Bear took advantage of the break in the weather to check his trap lines and assess their supply situation, leaving Eliza alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. She used the solitude to explore corners of the cabin she hadn't yet examined, driven by a curiosity that was part practical and part personal. In the workshop area, she discovered Bear's more intimate artifacts, tools worn smooth by years of use, half-finished carvings, and a small wooden box tucked away on a high shelf. The box drew her attention because of its obvious age and the care with which it had been crafted. After a moment's hesitation, she climbed on a chair and lifted it down, finding it surprisingly heavy for its size. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, she found something that made her breath catch. A Civil War medal, bronze and tarnished with age, engraved with the words, "For valor in service to the Union." Beneath the medal lay other items, a faded daguerreotype of a young woman holding an infant, a wedding ring too small for Bear's large hands, and a letter written in a woman's careful script. Eliza knew she should replace everything and climb down, but something about the photograph held her transfixed. The woman's face was gentle and intelligent, with the kind of beauty that came from inner strength rather than mere physical perfection. She was still studying the photograph when Bear returned, stamping snow from his boots and calling out a greeting. The sound of his voice startled her into awareness of what she was doing, and she quickly began replacing the items in the box. "I'm sorry," she said as he appeared in the doorway of the workshop. "I was looking for something to read and saw the box. I shouldn't have." "It's all right," Bear said quietly, though she could see the pain that flickered across his features. He approached slowly, as if the box contained something that might explode if handled carelessly. "Sarah and Thomas," he said simply, nodding toward the photograph. "My wife and son." Eliza felt her heart constrict at the simple words and the weight of loss they carried. "They're beautiful," she said softly. Bear took the photograph from her hands, his thumb tracing the edges with the careful touch of someone handling something precious and fragile. "She was a teacher, too, before we married. Had plans to start a school for the children of cavalry families. Said every child deserved the chance to learn, regardless of their circumstances." The parallel to her own dreams was not lost on Eliza. "What happened to them?" Bear was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, each word measured and deliberate. "Comanche raid while I was away on patrol. The fort was supposed to be secure, but the guards had gotten complacent. By the time we returned..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "That's why you came to the mountains," Eliza said, understanding flooding through her. "Couldn't stay in a world where I'd failed the people I was supposed to protect. Up here, there was nobody depending on me, nobody I could let down." He carefully placed the photograph back in the box. "Until now." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Eliza understood that he wasn't just talking about providing her shelter. He was acknowledging that his careful isolation had been breached, that she had become someone whose welfare mattered to him in ways that terrified a man who had already lost everything once. "The medal," she said. "What was it for?" Bear's smile was bitter. "Some fool thing during the war, saved a supply train from Confederate raiders. Command thought it made me a hero." He gestured toward the workshop, toward the life he had built in the mountains. Lot of good it did when it mattered. Eliza could see the self-recrimination that had driven him to this exile, the way guilt had twisted his perception of events beyond his control. "You can't blame yourself for being away when it happened," she said gently. "Can't I? I was the one who convinced Sarah to come west, told her it would be an adventure. She wanted to stay in Ohio, close to her family, but I had grand ideas about making a difference on the frontier." Bear's hands clenched and unclenched as he spoke. "If I'd listened to her, they'd still be alive." The pain in his voice was so raw that Eliza felt it like a physical blow. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his mountain years. "And if I had been stronger, I never would have married Charles," she said quietly. "We can't live our lives trapped by what might have been." Bear looked down at their joined hands, surprised by the comfort he found in her touch. For 15 years, he had avoided human contact, telling himself that solitude was safer than connection. But there was something about Eliza's presence that made him question those careful barriers he had constructed around his heart. "I dream about them sometimes," he admitted. "Not nightmares, just memories. Sarah reading by the fire, Thomas learning to walk. Good dreams that hurt worse than any nightmare because I wake up and remember they're gone." "Do you think they would have wanted this for you?" Eliza asked. 15 years of isolation, punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. The question struck him like a physical blow. Sarah had been a woman of strong opinions, never shy about expressing her thoughts on matters of importance. The idea of her husband hiding in the mountains, cutting himself off from the world and the possibility of helping others, would have horrified her. "Sarah would have boxed my ears," he said with a rueful smile. "She never had patience for self-pity. Then maybe it's time to honor their memory by living again, instead of just surviving." Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the distant whicker of a horse somewhere below on the mountain. Bear immediately moved to the window, scanning the approaches to the cabin with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to read danger in the landscape. "How many?" Eliza whispered, joining him at the window. "Can't tell yet, but someone's coming up the trail, and they're trying to be quiet about it." Bear's expression had transformed from the vulnerable man sharing his grief to the alert predator who had survived 15 years in the wilderness. "Get your things together, quietly." As Eliza moved to gather her few possessions, Bear opened a hidden compartment in the workshop and withdrew a rifle that gleamed with careful maintenance. The medals and photographs went back into their box, but this time he tucked it inside his coat rather than returning it to the shelf. "There's a root cellar beneath the cabin," he said quietly. "If things go bad, you hide there and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What about you?" Bear checked his rifle with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "I'm done running from other people's fights," he said, "and I'm not losing anyone else I care about." The words hung in the air between them, an admission of feeling that changed everything. Eliza felt her heart race, not just from fear of the approaching danger, but from the recognition that Bear had just acknowledged what had been growing between them for weeks. Outside, the sound of horses grew closer, accompanied now by the low murmur of men's voices. Jake and his companions had finally found them, and the winter sanctuary that had sheltered their growing love was about to become a battleground. Bear moved to the door, rifle in hand, and turned back to look at Eliza one more time. In that glance, she saw 15 years of loneliness and loss, but also something new: hope, determination, and the fierce protectiveness of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "Stay hidden until I call for you," he said, "no matter what you hear." As the first shadows appeared on the trail below, Eliza realized that their peaceful interlude was over. The real test of what they had built together was about to begin. The three riders approached the cabin with the careful coordination of men experienced in violence. Bear watched from the window as they spread out, Jake taking the direct approach while his companions moved to flank the building. They were professionals, but they were also operating in terrain that Bear knew better than his own heartbeat. "Samuel Carson," Jake's voice carried clearly across the snow-covered clearing. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Bear felt ice settle in his stomach. They knew his real name, not just the identity he had assumed, but the name from his military records. This was no longer just about Eliza's husband hunting down a runaway wife. This was something much more dangerous. "Come on out, Sergeant Carson," Jake continued. "Funny thing about military records. Sometimes they tell interesting stories about men who just disappear, men who might have seen things they weren't supposed to see." From her hiding place in the root cellar, Eliza could hear every word through the floorboards. The name meant nothing to her, but the change in Bear's posture was visible even from below. Whatever Jake was talking about, it had struck home. "I've got nothing to say to you," Bear called back, his rifle trained on the clearing. Jake's laugh carried the cold humor of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Oh, I think you do. See, we weren't just hired to bring back Mrs. Kane. We were hired to find the man who killed Colonel Marcus Kane at Willow Creek 15 years ago." The words hit Bear like a physical blow. Eliza's husband wasn't just Charles Kane. He was the son of Colonel Marcus Kane, the commanding officer whose corruption and cowardice had led to the massacre at Willow Creek. The colonel who had ordered Carson's patrol away from the settlement just hours before the raid, claiming intelligence that proved to be false. "That's right, Carson," Jake continued, evidently reading the shock on Bear's face. "Young Charles has been looking for you for a long time. Seems his daddy never made it home from that last patrol. Found his body in a ravine, bullet in the back of his head. Coincidence that his most vocal critic disappeared the same day. The pieces of the conspiracy fell into place with sickening clarity. Bear remembered that final confrontation with Colonel Kane, the heated argument about the intelligence that was pulling the patrol away from Willow Creek. Kane had been insistent, almost desperate to get Carson's unit away from the settlement. Later, when Bear had tried to report his suspicions about Kane's motives, he had found his commanding officer dead and himself the prime suspect. "The beauty of it," Jake called out, his voice growing closer, "is that Charles gets his wife back and his father's killer all in one package. 2 birds, 1 stone. Course, ain't nobody said you had to be breathing when we delivered you." From the cellar, Eliza understood the terrible irony of their situation. She had fled from one Kane only to find sanctuary with the man accused of killing another. But as she listened to the accusation, something didn't fit. The Bear she had come to know was capable of violence in defense of others, but cold-blooded murder? It was impossible to reconcile with the gentle man who carved wooden spoons and preserved wildflowers. "You're making a mistake," Bear called out, though he was already moving away from the window, knowing that Jake's words were meant to distract him while the other men got into position. "Am I? Let me tell you what I think happened at Willow Creek. I think Colonel Kane figured out that you suspected his deal with the Comanche, maybe even knew about the weapons he was selling them. So he arranged for you to be away when they hit the settlement, thinking you'd be blamed for failing to protect it. But you got wise to him, didn't you? Came back early and put a bullet in his brain before he could finish covering his tracks." The accusation was close enough to the truth to be terrifying. Bear had suspected Kane of corruption, had even begun gathering evidence of the Colonel's secret dealings with hostile tribes. But he had never gotten the chance to act on his suspicions. The raid had come first, taking Sarah and Thomas and destroying any possibility of justice. "Problem is," Jake continued, "Kane had already sent word to his son about you, told Charles to watch for a sergeant named Carson who might come looking for revenge. When Carson disappeared and Kane turned up dead, well, 2 + 2 makes 4. A rifle shot exploded the window beside Bear's head, sending glass shards across the cabin floor. The flanking maneuvers were complete. Jake's men had him surrounded, but Bear had advantages they couldn't know about 15 years of preparing for exactly this kind of siege. Moving with practiced efficiency, Bear triggered a hidden mechanism that dropped iron shutters over the windows, transforming the cabin into a fortress. The shutters were his own design, installed during the cabin's construction as protection against everything from human enemies to mountain storms. "Eliza," he called softly toward the cellar, "can you hear me?" "Yes," came her muffled reply. "There's a tunnel that leads from the cellar to the woodshed. Follow it and wait for my signal. If something happens to me, there's a cache of supplies hidden in the cave behind the waterfall. Maps, money, enough to get you to California." "I'm not leaving you," Eliza called back, her voice fierce with determination. Before Bear could respond, Jake's voice boomed across the clearing again, but this time it was directed toward the cabin's hidden occupant. "Mrs. Kane, I know you can hear me. Your husband's got a real nice reward posted for your safe return. Course, he also made it clear that your safe return don't necessarily mean you have to be in one piece." The threat hung in the air like a poison. Bear felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest, not the hot anger of a young soldier, but the calculated fury of a man who had learned patience in the hardest school of all. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake continued. "You're going to come out, both of you, and we're going to have a nice civilized conversation about who owes what to whom. Or we're going to burn you out and take our chances with the charcoal." Bear knew that Jake wasn't bluffing. Men like that had no qualms about destroying what they couldn't control. But 15 years of mountain living had taught Bear things about siege warfare that no military manual could cover. Moving to a hidden panel in the floor, Bear opened his emergency armory. Weapons, ammunition, and supplies cached against exactly this kind of emergency. Among them was something that made him smile grimly. Dynamite left over from his mining days, along with a coil of fuse wire and a box of matches. "Eliza," he called softly, "I need you to listen very carefully. In 5 minutes, I'm going to create a distraction. When you hear the explosion, use the tunnel to get to the woodshed, then make your way to the cave. Don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just run." "What are you going to do?" Bear looked at the photograph of Sarah and Thomas, then carefully tucked it inside his shirt, next to his heart. "I'm going to finish something I should have finished 15 years ago." Outside, Jake was losing patience. "Last chance, Carson. Come out now or we come in shooting." Bear lit the fuse and counted to 3 before answering. "Jake," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow, "you want to know what really happened to Colonel Kane? I'm listening. He was a traitor and a coward who sold weapons to the Comanche and got my family killed. And you're right about one thing. I should have put a bullet in him when I had the chance." The explosion that followed turned the night into day, sending chunks of frozen earth and splintered wood high into the air. But it wasn't the cabin that exploded, it was Jake's carefully planned siege, as Bear's charges detonated in the trees around the clearing, creating chaos and confusion among the attackers. In the aftermath of the blast, as Jake and his men struggled to regroup, Bear emerged from the cabin like a ghost of vengeance, moving through the smoke and shadows with the deadly efficiency of a man who had finally found something worth killing for. The explosion had scattered Jake's men, but not defeated them. As the smoke cleared and the echoes died away in the mountain peaks, Bear could see them regrouping at the edge of the clearing, their professional discipline reasserting itself despite the surprise. Jake himself stood near the tree line, his scarred face illuminated by the flames that had caught in one of the pine trees, shouting orders to his companions. Bear moved through the shadows like a predator in his natural element, every tree and rock formation as familiar as the rooms of his cabin. 15 years of solitary hunting had taught him to read the mountain's moods, to use its terrain as both weapon and shield. The dynamic had shifted. No longer were they besieging him in his fortress. Now he was hunting them on ground of his choosing. From the woodshed, Eliza watched the deadly game unfolding with a mixture of terror and admiration. She had reached the position Bear had specified, but instead of continuing to the cave as instructed, she found herself paralyzed by the sight of him moving through the night like something out of legend. This was not the gentleman who had carved wooden spoons and preserved wildflowers. This was the cavalry sergeant who had earned a medal for valor, a warrior awakened from 15 years of dormancy. Jake's voice carried across the clearing, thick with frustrated rage. "Spread out. He can't watch all approaches at once. Martinez, circle around to the north. Williams, take the creek bed. I'll keep him talking." Bear smiled grimly at Jake's tactical mistake. The bounty hunters were thinking like men hunting a single target, not like soldiers facing an enemy who knew every inch of the battlefield. They had numbers and modern weapons, but Bear had something more valuable, intimate knowledge of terrain that could multiply a single defender's effectiveness exponentially. Moving to a position he had scouted years earlier, Bear settled behind a fallen log that provided both cover and an excellent field of fire. From here, he could see the main approaches to the cabin while remaining invisible to anyone below. His father's rifle, a Winchester .4440, that had served him faithfully through 15 Montana winters, felt comfortable in his hands. The first shot came from Martinez, attempting to suppress Bear's position while Williams moved through the creek bed. Bear didn't return fire immediately, letting them commit to their positions before revealing his own. Patience was a luxury that the attackers couldn't afford. Every minute they remained exposed on the mountain increased their vulnerability to the cold and the terrain. When Williams emerged from the creek bed, thinking himself concealed by a stand of aspen trees, Bear's shot took him cleanly through the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the snow. Not a killing shot, Bear had no quarrel with hired guns, following orders, but enough to remove him from the fight. "Williams is down!" Martinez called out, his voice tight with concern. "How bad?" Jake's response carried across the clearing. "Shoulder wound. He's alive but out of the fight." Bear used their distracted attention to change position, moving through terrain features he had memorized during countless hunting expeditions. A dry stream bed provided concealed movement for 50 yards, bringing him to a rocky outcropping that offered a different angle on their positions. From the woodshed, Eliza could see the tactical situation developing with awful clarity. Bear was outnumbered but fighting on familiar ground, using the mountain itself as his ally. Yet she could also see what he perhaps could not. Jake was not just trying to win a firefight. He was driving Bear toward a specific area of the clearing, using his men's positions to channel the defender's movement. As if reading her thoughts, Jake called out across the snow, "You're good, Carson, I'll give you that, but you're fighting yesterday's war. This ain't about tactics anymore, it's about what you value most." The bounty hunter's words carried an ominous undertone that made Eliza's blood run cold. Jake wasn't just positioning his men for an assault on Bear, he was positioning them to threaten the cabin, and by extension, her. "See, the thing about mountain men," Jake continued, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a predator who had cornered his prey, "is that they get attached to their territory. Hard to abandon something you've spent 15 years building, ain't it? Especially when there's someone inside you care about." Bear understood the threat immediately. Jake was no longer trying to capture him through superior firepower. He was using Eliza as leverage, betting that Bear's protective instincts would override his tactical advantages. It was a strategy that might have worked against a younger man, but Bear had learned hard lessons about the cost of emotional decisions. Instead of responding to the provocation, Bear continued his methodical repositioning, working his way to a position that would give him clean shots at all three of his enemies simultaneously. The rocky outcropping provided excellent cover while offering multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated. More importantly, it allowed him to protect the cabin approaches without exposing himself to crossfire. From her position in the woodshed, Eliza made a decision that would have horrified Bear if he had known about it. Moving carefully through the scattered equipment, she found what she was looking for, a hunting rifle that Bear kept for emergency use, along with a box of ammunition. The weapon was unfamiliar in her hands, but her father had taught her the basics of firearms during her childhood in Ohio. "Martinez!" Jake's voice carried new urgency. "Can you get a clean shot at the cabin?" "Maybe." "Why?" "Because our friend Carson needs a reminder of what he's fighting for." The implication was clear, and Bear felt cold rage settle in his chest. Jake was planning to threaten Eliza directly, using her as a human shield to force Bear into the open. It was the kind of tactic that separated mere criminals from true predators, the willingness to target innocents to achieve tactical advantage. Bear's response was swift and decisive. A shot from his Winchester sent bark flying from the tree where Martinez had taken cover, followed immediately by a second shot that shattered a branch inches from the bounty hunter's head. The message was clear: any threat to the cabin would be met with lethal force. "Getting nervous, Carson?" Jake called out, but Bear could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The bounty hunter had expected his threat to flush Bear into the open, not provoke a demonstration of marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural. What Jake couldn't know was that Bear had been preparing for exactly this scenario for 15 years. Every defensive position had been scouted, every angle calculated, every contingency planned. The cabin wasn't just his home, it was a fortress designed by a man who understood that some things were worth dying to protect. As the standoff continued, the temperature began to drop with the mountain darkness. Jake's men were city dwellers, unaccustomed to the killing cold that could sap strength and cloud judgment within hours. Bear, on the other hand, had learned to use the mountain weather as another weapon in his arsenal. "This is your last chance, Carson," Jake called out, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. "Surrender now, and maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement." Keep fighting, and I guarantee you that pretty schoolteacher of yours won't survive the night." It was the wrong thing to say to a man who had already lost everything once to violent men. Bear's response came not in words but in action. A shot that took Jake's hat clean off his head, followed by the sound of a lever-action rifle being cycled with mechanical precision. From the woodshed, Eliza watched the final pieces of the confrontation falling into place. Bear had superior position and intimate knowledge of the terrain, but Jake had one advantage that trumped all others. He was willing to threaten innocent life to achieve his goals. It was an advantage that good men couldn't match, a fundamental asymmetry that tipped the scales toward evil unless someone was willing to level the playing field. Looking down at the rifle in her hands, Eliza realized that she might be that someone. She had fled from one form of violence, only to find herself in the middle of another, but this time she was not powerless. This time she had choices. As Jake's voice rose again across the clearing, outlining new threats and fresh ultimatums, Eliza chambered around and settled into the shooting position her father had taught her 20 years earlier. She was no longer just the victim in this story. She was about to become an active participant in determining its outcome. The mountain knight held its breath, waiting for the final confrontation that would determine not just who lived and who died, but what kind of future was possible for two broken people who had found in each other the courage to stop running from their past. The final confrontation began with Jake's miscalculation. Convinced that Bear's protective instincts would override his tactical judgment, the bounty hunter made his move toward the cabin, using the darkness and scattered debris from the explosion as cover. What he didn't expect was Eliza's rifle shot from the woodshed, the bullet splitting the air inches from his head and sending him diving for cover behind a stack of split logs. "Well now," Jake called out, his voice tight with surprise and grudging respect. "Seems like the schoolteacher's got some backbone after all." Bear felt his heart stop at the sound of gunfire from Eliza's position. She was supposed to be safely hidden, following the escape route he had prepared. Instead, she had chosen to stand and fight, making herself a target in a battle that was already deadly enough, with just him involved. "Eliza!" he called out, his voice carrying both command and concern. "Get to the cave." "Not without you," her response came back, clear and determined despite the fear he could hear underneath. Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the cold air. "Touching, really. Nothing like true love to make folks do stupid things. Martinez, can you get a shot at the woodshed?" The answer came in the form of rifle fire that splintered the wood around Eliza's position, forcing her to duck below the shed's rough walls. Bear's return fire was immediate and precise, sending Martinez scrambling for better cover and buying Eliza precious seconds to relocate. The battle had become a three-way dance of death, with each participant seeking advantage while the mountain night closed in around them. Bear moved from position to position with the fluid grace of a man who knew every rock and tree, while Jake and his remaining companion tried to coordinate their attacks, despite the confusion of the terrain and the darkness. A burning beam from the damaged cabin fell across the clearing, casting wild shadows that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The fire was spreading, fueled by the dry wood and the wind that funneled down from the peaks. What had begun as a siege was becoming a race against time as the flames threatened to consume everything Bear had built. "You see that, Carson?" Jake called out, his voice carrying dark satisfaction. "All those years of work, going up in smoke. Was it worth it? Was protecting one runaway wife worth losing everything?" Bear's answer came in the form of action rather than words. Moving with deadly purpose, he flanked Martinez's position and put a bullet through the bounty hunter's leg, sending him sprawling in the snow with a cry of pain and rage. The tactical situation had shifted. Now it was 2 against 1, with Jake's wounded companion more liability than asset. From the woodshed, Eliza could see the battle's momentum changing. Bear was winning through superior knowledge of the terrain and years of accumulated skill, but the cost was becoming apparent. The cabin that had sheltered their growing love was being consumed by flames, its carefully crafted walls and the memories they contained turning to ash and smoke. Jake seemed to recognize that his mission was failing. His men were down, his tactical advantages neutralized, and the cold was beginning to affect his judgment and reflexes. But rather than retreat, he made the choice that separated men like him from ordinary criminals. He decided that if he couldn't win, he would ensure that nobody else could either. "Last chance, Carson," Jake shouted, his voice carrying across the burning clearing. "You want to see your woman live through this. You come out where I can see you. No rifle, hands where I can see them. Otherwise, I put a bullet in that shed, and we see how good a teacher she is at dodging gunfire." It was the ultimatum Bear had been expecting, the moment when Jake's desperation would override his professionalism. The bounty hunter was prepared to murder an innocent woman rather than admit failure, a choice that revealed the true darkness at the heart of men who lived by violence. Bear made his decision with the cold clarity of a man who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. Rising from his concealed position, he stepped into the firelight with his hands clearly visible, his rifle left behind among the rocks. "Here I am, Jake," he called out, his voice steady despite the desperate nature of his gamble. "Let's finish this like men." Jake emerged from his own cover, pistol drawn and trained on Bear's chest. In the dancing light of the burning cabin, the two men faced each other across 30 yards of snow-covered ground, the aging bounty hunter and the mountain man who had finally found something worth dying for. 15 years, Jake said, his voice carrying a note of professional respect. "You've had 15 years to perfect your little mountain fortress. But in the end, it all comes down to who's faster with a gun." Bear smiled, an expression that held no warmth but carried the weight of accumulated patience and purpose. "You're right about one thing, Jake. It does all come down to speed. Question is, how fast can you move with a bullet in your back?" Jake's eyes widened as he realized the implication, but before he could turn, Eliza's shot from the woodshed took him center mass, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the snow. The schoolteacher who had claimed to be helpless had proven herself to be anything but. Jake lay in the blood-stained snow, his breathing labored, but his eyes still burning with the fury of a predator, denied his kill. Eliza's shot had taken him through the chest, but not cleanly. He was dying, but slowly, with enough time for final words and final choices. "Schoolteacher's got better aim than I gave her credit for," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. "But this ain't over, Carson. Charles Kane's got long arms and a longer memory. He'll send others." Bear approached carefully, his retrieved rifle trained on the wounded man. Around them, the cabin continued to burn, casting everything in hellish red light. Martinez lay unconscious in the snow where he had fallen, while Williams had managed to crawl behind a tree, clutching his wounded shoulder, but no longer a threat. "Maybe he will," Bear replied quietly. "But they'll face the same mountains, the same winter, and the same man who's been preparing for this fight for 15 years. Jake's laugh turned into a coughing fit that brought up more blood. "You think this is about bounty hunting? About bringing back a runaway wife?" His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried clearly in the cold air. "Charles Kane don't just want his property back. He wants to erase every trace of the man who killed his daddy. And he's got the money and connections to keep sending men until one of them gets lucky." Eliza emerged from the woodshed, still carrying the rifle that had saved their lives. Her hands were steady, but Bear could see the shock in her eyes as she took in the scene of violence that surrounded them. This was not the world she had known as a teacher in Ohio, but it was the world she had been forced to enter when she fled her marriage. "It has to end," she said quietly, looking down at Jake's bleeding form. "This cycle of violence, of men hunting other men for money and revenge, it has to end somewhere." Jake's eyes fixed on her with something that might have been respect. "Pretty words, schoolteacher, but you just put a bullet in a man's chest. How's that for ending violence?" Before Eliza could respond, Bear knelt beside the dying bounty hunter. "You mentioned Charles Kane's connections," he said. "What kind of connections?" Jake's smile was bitter. "The kind that matter. Judges, politicians, law enforcement. Daddy Kane might have been a corrupt bastard, but he was smart about covering his tracks. Made sure his son inherited more than just money. He inherited influence. The implications were clear. Even if they survived this immediate threat, Charles Kane's resources would allow him to keep sending hunters until eventually one succeeded. Bear and Eliza could run, could try to disappear into the vast western territories, but they would always be looking over their shoulders. "There is another way," Jake wheezed, his voice growing weaker. "Kane's empire is built on his reputation. Respectable businessman, grieving son, devoted husband, but reputations can be destroyed if someone knows where to look." Bear leaned closer. "What are you talking about?" Daddy Kane kept records, detailed records of every dirty deal, every bribe, every murder he ordered. Insurance, he called it. Protection against his partners turning on him. Jake's breathing was becoming more labored. Those records still exist, hidden in Chicago, in a place only family would know about. Eliza felt her heart race. If such evidence existed, it could not only clear Bear's name, but destroy Charles Kane's ability to pursue them. "Where?" she asked urgently. Jake's eyes were starting to glaze, but he managed one final revelation. Ask his wife, his real wife, the one he keeps locked away in the asylum while he parades his second marriage around Chicago society. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Her marriage to Charles had been built on a lie more fundamental than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just a runaway wife, she was an unwitting accomplice to bigamy, a woman whose entire life with Charles had been constructed around concealing his earlier crimes. Jake's breathing stopped with a wet rattle that echoed across the burning clearing. In death, his face relaxed into something almost peaceful, as if revealing Charles Kane's secrets had been his final act of defiance against a corrupt system. Bear stood slowly, his mind processing the implications of what they had learned. The evidence that could clear his name and destroy Charles Kane existed, but obtaining it would require returning to the very world they had been trying to escape. "We have to go back," Eliza said quietly, reading his thoughts. "To Chicago. We have to find those records." Bear looked at the burning cabin, at the home he had built with his own hands that was now being consumed by flames. 15 years of careful isolation were ending, not with retreat, but with the decision to engage with the world that had tried to destroy him. "The cabin's gone," he said simply. "Everything I built here is ash. But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe I needed to lose this place to find something more important." In the dancing light of the flames, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, they stood together and made the choice that would define the rest of their lives. They would not run from Charles Kane's vengeance. They would meet it head-on, armed with the truth about his father's crimes. The blood-stained snow around Jake's body told its own story of justice served and prices paid. Williams had managed to drag himself to his feet, his wounded shoulder making him no threat, but still requiring attention. Bear approached him with his rifle lowered but ready. "Your friend's dead," Bear said simply. "Martinez needs medical attention. You can take him and ride out of here, or you can join Jake in the snow. Your choice." Williams nodded quickly, pain and shock making him eager to accept any offer that didn't involve more violence. "We'll go. Won't be back. See that you don't. And Williams, when you get back to whoever sent you, tell them what happened here. Tell them that Samuel Carson isn't hiding anymore." As Williams helped the semi-conscious Martinez onto a horse, Eliza moved to Bear's side. The rifle that had saved their lives felt foreign in her hands now that the immediate danger had passed, but she understood that she had crossed a line tonight. The woman who had fled Chicago in terror was gone, replaced by someone capable of violence when violence was necessary. "We'll need supplies," Bear said, watching the two wounded men disappear into the darkness. "Money, travel documents, and a plan for getting into Chicago without Kane knowing we're coming." "I have money," Eliza said quietly. hidden in the cave where you told me to go. I took everything I could when I left Charles, including some jewelry that should be worth enough to fund our journey." Bear nodded, then looked back at his burning cabin one final time. The structure that had sheltered his grief for 15 years was being reduced to embers and memory, but standing beside Eliza in the firelight, he felt no regret. The man who had built this refuge was gone, replaced by someone ready to fight for the future rather than hide from the past. "There's something else," Eliza said, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "About Charles's first wife. If she's still alive, if she's in an asylum, she might not be insane at all. She might just be another woman who learned too much about the Kane family secrets." The possibility hung between them like a promise of justice, deferred, but not denied. If they could reach Chicago, if they could find the evidence Jake had described, they might be able to destroy Charles Kane's carefully constructed life just as thoroughly as he had tried to destroy theirs. As dawn began to lighten the eastern peaks, Bear and Eliza salvaged what they could from the ruins and prepared for a journey that would take them far from the mountain sanctuary that had sheltered their love. Behind them, the last flames consumed the final remnants of Bear's self-imposed exile. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the chance to reclaim their lives from the men who had tried to steal them. Spring came early to the mountains that year, but Bear and Eliza were not there to witness the thaw. By the time the snow began to melt and reveal the blackened ruins of the cabin, they were already in Chicago, armed with evidence that would reshape both their futures and the fate of Charles Kane. The journey east had taken them through Denver, where Bear's carefully hoarded gold had purchased new identities and respectable clothing. Eliza had transformed herself back into Elizabeth Kane, the wealthy businessman's wife, while Bear became William Carson, her cousin from Colorado Territory. The deception was necessary. Charles Kane's influence in Chicago ran deep, and they needed time to gather evidence before their presence was discovered. Finding Martha Kane, Charles's first wife, had proved easier than expected. The asylum where she was confined was expensive and discreet, the kind of place where wealthy families warehoused inconvenient relatives. Martha was not insane. She was simply a woman who had discovered her husband's connections to his father's crimes and been silenced before she could act on that knowledge. The reunion between the two women had been painful and revelatory. Martha had been imprisoned for 7 years, declared mentally incompetent after she had threatened to expose Charles's role in covering up his father's corruption. The evidence she had gathered, letters, financial records, detailed accounts of bribes and murders, had been hidden in a safety deposit box under an assumed name, waiting for someone with the courage to use it. "I knew someone would come eventually," Martha had told them during their clandestine meeting. "Charles is too arrogant to believe he can control everything forever. I just never imagined it would be his second wife and the man his father tried to frame." The irony was not lost on any of them. Charles Kane's attempt to eliminate the threats to his empire had instead brought those threats together, creating an alliance he could never have anticipated. The evidence Martha had preserved was devastating. Colonel Kane's private correspondence revealed a network of corruption that reached from frontier army posts to the halls of Congress. Weapons sold to hostile tribes, battles deliberately lost for financial gain, civilian settlements sacrificed to cover tracks. It was a catalogue of treason that had cost hundreds of lives. Most damning of all was a letter in Charles's own hand, written shortly after his father's death, acknowledging his role in framing Samuel Carson for the colonel's murder. The letter, apparently intended as insurance against potential partners, laid out the entire conspiracy in Charles's careful script. Armed with this evidence, Bear had done something he hadn't done in 15 years. He had walked into a federal courthouse and demanded justice. The response had been swift and dramatic. Within days, warrants were issued not just for Charles Kane, but for a dozen other men connected to his father's network. The corruption that had festered for decades was finally exposed to the light. Charles Kane's arrest had been a sensation in Chicago society. The respectable businessman was revealed as the son of a traitor, a bigamist who had imprisoned his legal wife to conceal his crimes. His shipping empire collapsed within weeks as partners fled and creditors called in debts. The man who had commanded such fear and respect found himself facing a hangman's noose. But for Bear and Eliza, the victory felt incomplete until they stood together in a small church outside Chicago, exchanging vows before a justice of the peace who had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the unusual circumstances. Martha Kane, finally free from the asylum, served as their witness, her presence a reminder of how much they had all sacrificed for this moment. "Do you, Samuel, take Elizabeth to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Bear's voice was steady, his hand warm in Eliza's as they spoke, the words that made their bond official. "Do you, Elizabeth, take Samuel to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Eliza's response carried the weight of a journey that had taken her from despair to hope, from victim to survivor to partner in something larger than herself. 6 months later, they stood together on a hillside, overlooking a valley in Oregon Territory, watching workers lay the foundation stones for a new cabin. This one would be larger than Bear's mountain refuge, with space for the school Eliza planned to establish and workshops where Bear could pursue his craftsmanship. The foundation stones were granite, quarried from the mountains they had left behind and hauled west at considerable expense. Bear had insisted on using them, saying that their new life should be built on the strength they had found in adversity. "It's going to be beautiful," Eliza said, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their first child was growing. Bear nodded, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the sun set over their new home. Different from what we left behind, but beautiful in its own way. The schoolhouse would be completed first, ready for the children of settlers who were already arriving in the valley. Eliza had found her calling again, but this time with the support of a man who understood the value of education and the courage it took to start over. Bear would teach practical skills, carpentry, hunting, the 100 small lessons that meant the difference between survival and prosperity on the frontier. They had returned to Cedar Ridge once, in late spring, to visit the ruins of the mountain cabin and the graves they had dug for Jake and Martinez. The town had welcomed them as heroes, the couple who had exposed corruption and brought justice to the frontier. Mrs. Miller had insisted on throwing them a celebration, though both Bear and Eliza found the attention uncomfortable. What mattered more was the quiet moment they had shared, standing among the blackened timbers of the cabin where they had first learned to love each other. The structure was gone, but the foundation stones remained, dark with soot but unbroken by the fire. "Those stones could be salvaged," Bear had observed. "For what? A school, maybe. Something that would honor what we built here." In the end, they had donated the land and the remaining materials to the town of Cedar Ridge, with the stipulation that it be used for education. The school that rose from the ashes of their winter sanctuary bore a simple plaque, in memory of all who find refuge in learning. Now, watching the Oregon sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Bear and Eliza felt the deep satisfaction of people who had not just survived their trials, but transformed them into something beautiful. The broken compass that had once symbolized Eliza's lost direction now sat on the mantel of their temporary cabin, pointing steadily toward their new home. They had learned that sometimes the coldest winters do indeed teach the warmest lessons about human kindness, and that love, once found, could be worth any price.